So thanks again for giving me the opportunity to be presenting at the conference as a keynote speaker, which is in fact the first time I'm doing that, which is an indication of either that my work has become visible or that the standards of the conference went down. And I hope it's the former rather than the latter. So the topic of my today's presentation is on the economic persistence despite the adverse policies. And it is based on kind of the mixture of the historical data and the present day data on Kyrgyzstan. And it's a joint work with fellow researchers, Catherine Gerkinger from University of Namur in Belgium, Gani Aldashev, surprisingly unrelated to me, professor from the Free University of Brussels, and Mate Fodor from the Satpayev University in Almaty. So a quick outline of the presentation. So I will start with the introduction, a bit of the glimpse into the literature on this topic, explain the data that we were using, a bit of econometrics, very non-technical, and also the results and conclusions. Okay. There is basically several strands of literature on the topic. So I will start with the literature on persistence. And for non-Western for the literature in general on persistence, the literature is rather thorough, and there were several papers analyzing the persistence in the economic outcomes over time. For example, studies by Chetty for the United States, Boserup for Denmark, and so on. They link the individuals over several generations, and what they do is, using the administrative records, they trace how the different descendants of the previous populations, how they fare over time, and whether the next generation, their economic position is correlated with the economic position of their forefathers. Also, another strand, for example, Clark and Cummins, and so on, what they do is they do trace various families or individuals by linking the surnames, and also looking at the persistence of economic outcomes across generations. What most of those studies find is that they do observe, indeed, the persistence in economic position across generation. The only question is the degree of persistence, whether it's strong or less so strong, but it's there. And in principle, the persistence of wealth, for example, in the Western world is not surprising per se, given the long history of property rights. Now, if you think of the non-Western world, things are different, and there are actually two interesting studies which do look at individuals in the non-Western setting. So, for example, Clark. So in this paper from Clark in 2014, he compares people in China with the same surname who would fare before the Chinese Cultural Revolution and after, and he finds the high degree of persistence in the social status. And the second paper, I think, which is, I guess, closest to ours, is by Alisher and his co-authors. So in this paper, they also do trace the individual level outcomes of 3 generations of Chinese. So the generation who lived before the Chinese Cultural Revolution, then those who grew up during the Cultural Revolution, and those who lived after. So basically the grandparents, the parents, and the individuals themselves. So the main finding of this paper is interesting, that although there was the kind of the equalizing effect of the communist policies during the Cultural Revolution, there was re-emergence of inequality and the hierarchy of the social status after the 1978 pro-market reforms. And in terms of the main mechanisms, how does persistence operate, the authors argue in favor of the transmission of various cultural values. So what they looked at, they compared the individuals who grew up with their parents, and therefore where there could be some transmission of the cultural values from parents to their children. And also they compared them to those individuals whose parents died early, and therefore the potential transmission link broke down. And the argument was that the re-emergence of inequality was the result that the cultural values were transmitted, and when the soil was fertile again for the market to operate, so from 1978 onward, it re-emerged. So that was the literature on persistence. Another strand of literature that we kind of go into is the literature on traditional institutions and economic development. And to be precise, the traditional institutions that we are interested in would be the tribes or the clans. And among those papers in this strand of literature, there is the paper by Moscona, where they find that ethnic groups who were organized along the kind of the clan lines, they would be more prone to conflicts. Although there could be other papers by, for example, Greif and Tablini, Lacroix, Enke, Acemoglu, and Robinson, where they do find actually positive aspects of the tribal or the clan institutions, because there were some solidarity norms, there was the democratic culture, social cooperation, and so on. So coming to what our paper is about, we look at the correlation between the clan or the tribe level material well-being in the pre-Soviet time, 1920, and compared it, whether it's correlated with the current or present day outcomes by using kind of unique combination of the rich historical data on Kyrgyzstan and the present day data. So what we do find is actually, quite surprisingly, there is strong correlation between the past and the present outcomes, even after controlling for the regional effects. And the remarkable thing about it is we do observe this correlation despite having 70 years of socialism, which was not only equalizing in terms of the redistributional policies, but also because of the repressive policies against the clan or tribe identity. And so the result of the implication of that could be that various informal or traditional institutions are quite resilient despite various adverse policies they can go through. And so then we talk about various channels through which could this operate. So again, of course, one might argue that it's because of the geographic location, so we do control for that. But there could be some intergenerational transmission of various intangibles, be it social values, but also the political or power capital. So we have some supportive evidence for that. And there could be also the various norms and values which go from one generation to another. All of that I will discuss today. I will probably just briefly flip through that. So historically, the Kyrgyz had really difficult times, waging wars against Jugas coming from China. There was also pressure from Kokand Khanate. And so eventually by late 18th century, early 19th century, the northern tribes of Kyrgyzstan sought Russian protectorate, which by the early 19th century, it became de facto Russian protectorate by then. And so what later happened, there was the abolition of serfdom in Russia in 1861, which led to quite substantial migration of peasants from Russia all the way to Kyrgyzstan, with resulting scarcity of land and impoverishment of the Kyrgyz population, which led also to clashes and riots in Kyrgyzstan. So the Kyrgyz at the time, well, I guess even today, are organized along the kind of hierarchical tribal system where there are three big kind of confederates of tribes: the left wing, the right wing, which is the biggest, and the Ichkilik, or the middle. And then each confederation is split into various tribes. They are split into various kind of sub-clans and further on. So each clan is headed by a manab. There was the council of manabs, which were kind of jointly ruling the tribe. And we see about roughly 35 main tribes for a total of population of 400,000 individuals around 1910. And the system of tribes or clans was very important in the early age, because the clans themselves would be dealing with quite a number of various issues. So land disputes and so on were handled locally by the tribes themselves. So then comes the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, and there were several reforms which the Bolsheviks launched, and the important one was the land reform. So this land reform was basically the collectivization of land and livestock and the formation of kolkhozes. And so because of this, they were really targeting the rich members of the society, which basically led to the clan or tribe leaders being singled out, their property being confiscated, some of them were sent to exile and so on. So by 1935, according to some historians, about 85% of the suitable land for agriculture was collectivized. And also the clan institutions or the tribal institutions received further blow during the Soviet times because there was the policy which explicitly forbade the formation of villages on the kinship basis. And so on the surface of it, you might say during the Soviet time, the various structures and the social norms were lost. So basically there were policies against the tribe identity. There was the policy of redistribution of wealth. And so that actually makes you expect that if any inequality or any difference in wealth which existed before should be gone by now because of the really long period of the Soviet rule. So coming to data that we are using in our research. So the historical data comes from the materials of the statistical expedition by Russian geographers Rumyantsev and Skriplov, which happened between 1907 to 1913. So these Russian colonial expeditions were taking place in what is known back then as the Turkestan Oblast, which is now split between Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. And so what they did back then is they surveyed basically all nomadic households. So it was basically a census, and it was very detailed about quite a number of things, mobility patterns of households. So where was the winter pasture, where was the summer pasture, whether the pastures had access to drinking water and so on. There was also the questions on the agricultural practices, how much land they had, whether it was irrigated or non-irrigated, what did they grow, how much they harvested and so on, and quite detailed questions on the livestock. So how many horses they had, cattle, sheep, and actually very detailed about not only how many horses, but what was how many one-year-old horses, how many three-year-old horses, and so on. So very, very detailed. Also, there were questions on whether they hire labor, for example, or they do the field work themselves, and so on. So possibly the main intention of the expeditions was more like to estimate how much land is available for the potential settlers from Russia, possibly how many men could be drafted in case of the mobilization, and also how much of the taxes could be collected. But for whatever reason it happened, it did provide us with a very detailed information, which we are using for our research. The current day data set, which we are linking to the past, is the life in Kyrgyzstan. So there is no point of me to explain what it means. Everyone who's sitting here has worked with the data. What would be important to note here is the unit of observation in the historical data and in the present data is the household or a family. The trouble is we cannot really trace and link the households themselves, because this would require knowing the complete genealogy of the current day families, which we don't have. So instead, what we do is we match the old historical and the present day data by tribes or clans. So in the historical data, the families, the households, they are asked about to which clan or tribe they belong to. And that was also the case in the third wave, so of life in Kyrgyzstan. So the 2012 data would also ask the question about the tribal belonging. There are still some challenges in linking the tribes themselves, because in the historical data, what the families report is basically the subclan, very low level hierarchy, without reporting the umbrella tribe. Whereas in the present day life in Kyrgyzstan data set, the majority of people, when they're asked about their tribe or clan belonging, they would normally associate themselves with a bigger level tribe. So naturally, we would really want to aggregate the lower subclans in the old data to some upper level tribe. The difficulty was that in the old data, they do not, when they report their subclan, they do not report the upper level tribe. So it's becoming a bit of a challenge to identify each subclan to a specific tribe. For that, we were using the data from the expedition of the Soviet historian Abramson from the 1950s, where he gave a very detailed genealogy of various tribes with the splitting into subclans and sub-subclans and so on. So what we do then is, using the old data, the present day data set, and the details of the expedition of Abramson as the link between these two. Nevertheless, there were some difficulties about this as well. It's not really very visible, but what you see on the left is the extract from the old historical data. You see the clan information, which is the sub-levels. And on the right, you see the life in Kyrgyzstan extract from the data set, where you see mostly they report the upper level tribe. The trouble is that if you look at the subclans in Kyrgyzstan, there are quite a number of subclans in different tribes having identical names, because mostly these names are the names of a specific person who became probably very important, so his descendants identify themselves into a separate clan bearing his name. But the trouble is, if you have various subclans of the same name and you don't know the upper level tribe, it's becoming a lot of a challenge to identify them. So in those cases, we try to rely also on the geographical location of the specific subclans, which was also what was recorded by Abramson in his fieldwork. Of course, we couldn't match all of them. At least in some cases, we could perfectly identify the tribe, in some cases only probabilistically, because there could be the villages where several clans co-reside, and so perfectly identifying the tribe is more of a problem. So this is more of a overview of the data we had and the difficulties we were facing. So in terms of the variables which were interesting for us, you would see the livestock, the land available, you had the size of the household, the size of the extended household, the number of females, and also geography of the location of the tribe. Now, coming to the brief preliminary exploratory results, there is some correlation between the clan size in the past and clan size in the present, which is probably less surprising, but there is also some correlation between some measures of well-being in the past and in the present. And also the correlation between the measures of inequality within clans before and today. So this graph simply reveals that there is some correlation between the size of the clans 100 years ago and today. Then this gives you a bit of a correlation between the wealth measure, the livestock in the past, and the income today. The measures the correlation between the livestock in the past and expenditures in the present. Various other measures like the land in the past and the income in the present. So also there is some correlation, not perfect though. And I will skip that. If you summarize that, let's see, where's the pointer? So how can I press the laser pointer to be showing it? Like this. Oh, okay, so it's green, you don't see that. Anyway, so if you look at the bottom segment, bottom on the left, there is some significant correlation between the land ownership in the past and the income today. And one from the bottom to the right, the correlation between the livestock in the past and the expenditures of tribes today. So that was more of the exploratory analysis and the partial correlation. So we also looked at the multivariate framework with a relatively simple econometric model where we have the various individual outcomes in the present for an individual belonging to a specific tribe residing in a specific region, being the function of individual characteristics and the past tribe characteristics, and also controlling for the geographical effects. And the regression was weighted because some clans had many members, some clans had few, so we weighted by the clan size. So let's see whether it's visible or not, but I will try to explain. So these are econometric results. And if you look at the first 4 columns and the upper panel, there is quite significant effect of the wealth in the past in 1910 on the various present-day outcomes, be it income or expenditure, expressed as the average income or the standardized income, doesn't matter. All of that shows the strong positive effect, which indicates some persistence. And also, if you break down the wealth index into its subcomponents, the ownership of land or the livestock, they also show the same strong effect. So, for example, the land ownership, this is the bottom panel, has a strong effect on the income and expenditure today. So that tells us that despite the quite a long period of equalization, we do see quite strong positive effects of the past on the present. Now I will probably try to move a bit quicker. So the persistence rate that we estimate is a 0.6, which is in fact higher than in quite a few other studies. This graph also tells you that there is quite a strong relationship between inequality within tribes in the past and inequality within tribes in the present. So one of the possible potential channels would be the political power. And to formally test this, we use data on the members of the parliament of the Soviet Kyrgyzstan at the time, the Supreme Soviet, and there were biographies of the Supreme Soviet members published by the Soviet government. And more interestingly, in the 70s, they also published the information on the place of birth. So we used data on 1972 and 1976, and by using the information of the place of birth, the village, we try to identify the tribal identity of the members of parliament. And then we ran the following model. The share of the political elite, meaning the number of members of parliament of a specific tribe in the total size of the parliament, which gives you how strongly the specific tribe is represented in the parliament. And of course, one might argue that the bigger the tribe, the bigger should be its representation. So that's why we have the share of the tribe itself as the control, and the variable X would be the various measures of the tribe wealth in the past. And reporting the results, what we can see here, if you look at the first column, the first row is not very interesting. It simply says the bigger is the tribe, the more members they have in the parliament, which is trivial. But controlling for that, if you look at for example, the last column, it tells us that, for example, the land ownership in 1910 gives you the bigger representation of this tribe in the Soviet times. And also the tribes which had more livestock also had bigger representations in the parliament in the Soviet times. So that gives us some ideas about the transmission mechanisms. So I will skip some of the results because we're running out of time. But the idea is that unlike the studies which you would see in the West, where there was the preservation of the property rights, where you could inherit the wealth of your parents, the persistence is not very surprising. If you're born to a richer family, you have better opportunities. Here, this link was broken down during the 70 years of socialism. And the question is then, how does the inequality between the tribes reemerged? And here we say that possibly it could be through a political power. So, for example, the richer tribes in the past, they played their way into the Soviet politics. And in fact, there is evidence by, for example, Junishalev, that the politicians in the Soviet times, they also played along the tribal lines. And although the appointment to bigger political positions were mostly determined by the loyalty to the regime, the politician to rule locally had to really rely on the tribal links. And so the clannish lines, the tribal lines remained very important even in the Soviet times. And later on, because those political power of the clans was preserved during the Soviet times, when the Soviet Union collapsed and with the introduction of the market reforms, those political power played by the new rules, leading to the re-emergence of the wealth inequality between the tribes. So, to conclude, what we do observe is quite high persistence of wealth and inequality over the span of about 100 years. Also, some of the recent studies find that there's high elasticity of taxable wealth with respect to net of the tax return, meaning that it makes sense to tax wealth. What we do find is that the wealth taxation may not necessarily be very helpful, because what we do see is that the various groups, they are quite adaptive to various policies. So, for example, we had the period of 70 years of wealth taxation, basically, in the Soviet time, which was very extreme taxation, perfect, well, relatively perfect equalization. But still, we had individuals, a group of individuals, find ways to transmit this wealth over to other generations through, for example, the political or social capital. And so it kind of lends support to this famous Pareto's law, so that we still observe this wealth distribution even after the quite drastic period of reforms by the Soviet government. And it did not seem to revert the fortunes within the society, because after that, once we reintroduced the market reforms or democracy, the old inequality, old wealth did return to the prominence. And so that gives us a bit of an indication that really the individuals or the groups of individuals in a system, they are really extremely resilient to various economic misfortunes. So thank you very much. I try to make it on time.
Thank you very much indeed. This idea that redistributive wealth taxes are ineffective is clearly a finding that's driving the policies of the government in my own country at the moment, as they try and reduce taxation and so on. Fantastic! It's a fantastic paper. I recommend everybody to read it. And it's in the Economic Journal. It's in the Economic Journal, and the web appendices that come with it are really, so rich, and it's so informative, and so much to learn from this paper and the data that it draws upon. We've got a few minutes for questions from the audience. So if you'd like to raise your hand if you have a question, and if someone could tell me if there's any online questions as well, that would be helpful. There are microphones. Tillman, you have a question, yeah?
Thank you very much. It's a fantastic paper. I really enjoyed it, like this really big, long-term sweep and look at history. Yeah, I think that's great, and it's often missing in economics. So I'm very grateful you and your colleagues brought that out. Thank you for sharing that. I just wondered, the effects you described, they seem more intuitive to me in, say, rural areas or areas where people do not migrate, whether internationally or locally. What about urbanization? Does that sort of cut the link? I don't know if you tried in the data to check the difference. Yeah, I mean, cities are supposed to be the places, where everybody mingles and sets free their creativity and so on, and their enterprise. Do cities break this pattern, or does the pattern persist even there? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question. It's really something I would expect as well. I have to admit, we didn't tackle this question deeply, so it could be the case, and I would expect that also the tribal identity to be less strong in the metropolitan areas in comparison to the rural areas. So that could be the case. I'm not sure how strong or weak is this, but there's still some evidence that people in the cities, I don't know if it's the generation of the people in the city, or let's say individuals who live in the city over several generations, or that's the new incoming people from the rural area. But if you look at the colloquial discussions, it seems to be that the tribal link is still there, and especially when it gets to politics, many individuals who, let's say, run for various posts, they do try to use the tribal identity question. But I agree that it should be weaker in the cities, yes.
Thanks. We have Kanat, and then we'll come to the...
One small question and comment. Thanks a lot, Alisher. It was extremely interesting and very important. First of all, one implication, it means that, let's say, Kyrgyz national elite save somehow institutionally the power during Soviet period, despite of decapitalization, despite of flowing power, and making really money in Soviet period was not important. You need to know that most of rural people in Soviet period don't receive any income until late 60s. For example, my grandmother started to receive salary in kolkhoz, in collective farm, only when she go to the pension around 65. Before that, they never received money at all. So it was somehow a mechanism of moving to maybe informal economy, first of all, and it's probably interesting. Also look, as Tillman mentioned, how about education? Probably it was one of the ways how elites transfer simply with because access to education was not really well established in Soviet period. Its situation changed in late 80s approximately. Before that, receiving higher education was a more privilege. Probably your parents will tell more about this. And another aspect which might be also have probably with your data it will be easily explorable. What about migration? Probably we will see that some clans who are not really represented now mostly need to export the members outside of the country because they have lower access to capital, to land into 100 years ago. And now this is an impact. It's extremely interesting, and it requires very long-term and maybe more very academic-wide multidisciplinary approach and study. Thanks a lot.
Once again, thank you for the great presentation. Actually, I also researched about the clan not only in Kyrgyzstan, but in the Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, also Druze system, and Avlod in Tajikistan. I'm also surprised why this clan system was, they could preserve the, despite the severe suppression of, and I just have a question for you. What do you think, like, what were the main root causes and that they could preserve the identity? And did you also analyze the gender aspect? I know that when we analyze the clan system, it's mostly goes through the male. Yeah, male is, it's inherited through the male system. This is the second question. And also, did you make any interlinkage between the Kyrgyz, Kazakh, and other clans? Because we know that there are several clans which are located not only in Kyrgyzstan, but also in Kazakhstan, and they have some connection. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. So you're definitely right about the potentially migration. That's an interesting topic which we didn't really look at, because I think in general we didn't have too many observations once you identify all clans, but there would be an interesting area for further research. You're also perfectly right about the educational link. This is in fact one of the first thing that naturally comes to mind, how you can preserve the wealth, for example. In fact, I just flipped through those slides because I was running out of time. But yes, we did look at the correlation between the wealth and education, but the link was very weak. So we didn't find enough supportive evidence for that story. So it doesn't mean that it wasn't really the case, but it seems probably, at least based on our evidence, the major mechanisms went through other channels. As for other question, so we didn't really look at this clan system in the neighboring countries. In fact, the major difficulty of working on the clans themselves or the tribes is the data where you have the tribe identifiers is virtually non-existent everywhere in this part of the country. With little evidence which is appearing now, that would be, of course, interesting to look up. The gender issue is something we would be very interested. We didn't really dig into it because mainly we looked only at the patrilineal descendants because, first of all, this is the major way how you identify with the clan. It's only based on the your father's line. But it would be interesting to see also how does it come into play through also, let's say, the tribes of your mother, or let's say the tribe of your wife, and so on. But the difficulty with this is in life in Kyrgyzstan, the respondents report their tribe in the household. So it's not really individual specific, it's more of the tribe of the whole household, which is basically, I presume, is the tribe of a father of the household. So we don't really have those identifiers to link it up also through the female side. But that would be an interesting question. So ideally, in further surveys, we'll have that too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really great presentation and keynote speech. And the level of the conference did not reduce this for sure. I think that is actually first keynote speech for over the 8 conference, which took so many questions and a lot of attention from the audience. So I have a few questions. One is a clarification question on the presentation. What was the size of the bubble? Because in several slides, you have different sizes of the bubble. So what was that? Second question is more related to policies. So it's from your research, it's very clear that if the government is implementing some policies to reduce inequality in the country, it actually needs to take into account some political economy and the tribe structure, right? So what would you think would be a good policy measure to reduce inequality, or at least to try to move towards this direction? Last is a remark for further research. I think it would be really interesting to see what is the current distribution of recent parliaments and compare whether this balance of tribes is actually holds over the years. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. So in terms of the policies, I'm probably not the right person to ask. I'm really bad at policy issues, so I don't really know. This is my honest answer. So definitely what the evidence show is we have to take the tribes or those kind of informal institutions seriously, because they do play a big role in the country. How to do that, whether it should go to extremes like some people propose, that the parliament should be based not on parties but on tribes, and each tribe should have a representation. I don't know. So this is my honest answer. In terms of the size of individual tribes, it varies. So some of those circles, the smaller circles, could be as small as around 20, and the bigger ones could go up to 700. So there are some bigger tribes which we see in the data, and there are some very small ones. There was something else which I missed, I guess. Oh, that's right, about recent parliament. We haven't done this. I do have the data on the parties and the members of parliament. No, I actually do have the representation of parties, but I have the data on who was in that party and who eventually got into parliament. Ideally, yes, it would be very interesting to look up those people, trying to find what their tribal identity would be, because the natural extension of this is the political science questions. That would be very nice and interesting. Yes, we didn't do that.
Because we started late, although we're out of time, I'm going to allow one more question just very quickly from the back there.
Alisher, first of all, thank you very much. It's a really nice and exciting presentation. And for all people who gathered here, I would probably like to highlight that all these became possible because of the data set that was developed in Kyrgyzstan. And I'm always excited when I brush through the academic literature and I come across the article which says Kyrgyzstan. It's really rare. And it's really nice that you managed to publish an academic article in a good journal, which is good. And in terms of question, I would just want to say it's really nice, but is there any specific implication for the political system in Kyrgyzstan. We would like to kind of, if we look at the political system in Kyrgyzstan through the prism of your findings, is there any interesting highlights that you could probably mention? Thanks.
So I think it really overlaps with the previous question. And I think in terms of the giving any conclusions or advice to the political system, I think it's still not enough evidence. I think this is one of the first papers addressing the tribal system. And I think we would need some more studies which would address this issue, and then collectively they could kind of shed more light onto what could be the advice for the policies here. But I think so far, the best advice would be we need some more research on that.
Thanks very much. This has been a fantastic talk. It's a great paper. I thoroughly recommend you read it. You know, not only does it use contemporary microdata to illuminate the present, but also to bring to life the past as well. And that's a really valuable addition to the literature. And it shows what the value of the Life in Kyrgyzstan survey is. But not only that, it also poses a whole bunch of future research questions. You know, what are these mechanisms? Are they cultural? Is it educational? Is it to do with social networks and so on? How does power and privilege play out within and across generations, not just in Kyrgyzstan, but more globally? And what are the policy implications? That's the really big and important question, and the interest of many people in this room. I just want to finish by saying one thing. There's a paper that was referred to by Alisher and a number of other authors that does a similar exercise in the case of China. And that's a really interesting contrast and support, actually, of the work of this paper. It's just recently been, a new version of it has recently been published. Whilst in your paper, you avoid speculating what the policy implications are, in their paper, they finish by speculating on what the policy implications are. And I have to tell you, they're pretty brutal, because they conclude that actually there wasn't enough destruction and you need to be much more destructive in order to wipe the slate clean, to kind of clean the memory of all of these potential pathways and reset equality from ground zero, as it were. So it just shows how difficult it is to think about the policy implications of this. And in my view, this opens up a whole new world of interesting research questions. So thank you so much for such a stimulating and important keynote speech. Thank you.
Yeah, that's right about this speculation is, you know, they might be concluding that you need to be more brutal to erase it from the memory. The question is whether you want it at the end of the day or not. But I just hope that it could also give further ground that more tribe or clan questions be included in the Life in Kyrgyzstan waves in the future. Thank you very much.